There was a chip that made a sound unlike anything else on the snack aisle. Not the thin crackle of a Lay's, not the hollow pop of a Pringle, something thicker, something louder. You opened the bag and the smell hit first. Real potato, not the powdered imitation kind. And then you bit down and the whole room heard it. That crunch was the point. That crunch was the whole argument. At its peak in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that bag was in supermarkets from Maine to California. It was in lunch boxes on Monday morning and on the picnic table on Saturday afternoon. Families bought it without thinking about it, the same way they bought milk or bread. Automatically, because it was always there, because it had always been good, because nothing on the shelf came close to what it delivered. The Keebler elves put it there. And then, without a press release, without a farewell, without so much as a note on the shelf, it was gone. How does a chip that millions of Americans still describe by name, 30 years after they last tasted it, simply disappear from every store in the country? This is the story of Oboise's, and the answer is more complicated and more frustrating than anyone who loved them ever knew. In the mid-1980s, a food scientist named Miles Willard was working out of Idaho Falls, Idaho, on a problem that most people in the snack industry had already In the mid-1980s, a food scientist named Miles Willard was working out of Idaho Falls, Idaho, on a problem that most people in the snack industry had already given up on. The problem was this. Every fabricated potato chip on the market tasted like a compromise. Pringles were consistent and stackable, but the potato flavor was thin, almost theoretical. Standard kettle chips had the flavor, but not the structure. Nobody had figured out how to build a chip from processed potato material that delivered the real, dense, earthy taste of an actual Idaho potato while still surviving a bag, a shelf, a cross-country distribution run. Willard thought he knew how to do it. He had spent years at the United States Department of Agriculture before founding his own firm, Miles Willard Technologies. By the time the 1980s arrived, he had already made his mark on the snack world several times over. Tato Skins, the potato skin-shaped chip that Keebler had launched in 1985, came from his work. So did Ripplin's. So did hula hoops in the United Kingdom. Willard was not a marketer or a brand strategist. He was an engineer who thought about food the way other engineers thought about bridges, as a structural problem with a correct solution waiting to be found. The solution he found for what would become Oboise's was called dual-sheeted fabrication. Instead of pressing a single layer of potato dough into a chip shape and cooking it, Willard's process pressed two thin layers together before they went into the oven. Those two layers never fully fused. The heat trapped air between them. What came out of the process was a chip with a light, bubbly interior. Visible pockets of air running through every piece, surrounded by a firmer outer shell. The result was a crunch that was dramatically louder and more satisfying than a single sheet chip could produce, combined with a potato flavor that was noticeably more concentrated because the dough itself carried more potato solids per bite. The machinery required to execute that process was built into one specific facility, a plant in Bluffton, Indiana. That plant was, by every account available, the only place in the United States capable of running the dual-sheeted line at commercial scale. That fact would matter enormously later. In 1988, it was simply the place where something genuinely new was being made. Keebler had been watching the salty snack market since the early 1980s with the particular hunger of a company that had built its reputation entirely on the sweet side of the aisle. Cookies, crackers, fudge-striped everything. Keebler was the hollow tree factory, and the elves were good at what they did. But Frito-Lay was sitting on 40+% of the American salty snack market, and the dollar volume was staggering. A company with Keebler's distribution infrastructure and retail relationships had every structural advantage needed to compete. What it lacked was a product worth competing with. Willard's dual-sheeted chip was that product. Keebler licensed the technology, committed to the Bluffton facility, and made a marketing decision that was either obvious or brilliant depending on how you look at it. They named the chip after the place the potatoes came from, Boise, Idaho, the capital of American potato country. The name they landed on was Oboise's, part exclamation, part geography, entirely memorable. The slogan wrote itself almost immediately. O Boise's are O boisterous. The Keebler elves, who had spent nearly 2 decades selling cookies in a tree, now had a chip worthy of their enthusiasm. The launch date was set for early March 1988. The grand introduction happened on March 3rd in Boise itself. A deliberate choice, a nod to the Idaho connection that was baked into every bag. 6 days later, on March the 9th, a grocery circular for Hirsch's Markets in Allentown, Pennsylvania was already listing O Boise's original potato chips as a new item at 89 cents for a 6.5-ounce bag. A Chicago Tribune marketing column from February 26th had already reported the launch, calling it one of the most anticipated snack introductions of the coming season. National distribution was not a gradual rollout. It was a sprint. The launch flavors were original and sour cream and onion. A barbecue variety appeared in store circulars at various points. A cheddar option showed up in grocery advertising by 1993. But from the very first week, it was the sour cream and onion that people reached for a second time. The original established what O Boise's were. The sour cream and onion was what they became. The flavor that decades later, when people try to describe what they lost, is the one they name first. A consumer panel review published in the Jacksonville Journal in 1988 tested the original flavor and found reactions that split almost perfectly along the line of what kind of chip eater you were. Several panelists compared them directly to Pringles in terms of construction. One called them the closest thing to Pringles she had encountered. Another said the crunch and freshness were the reason to buy them. A third noted they were less oily than most chips, which was either a selling point or a problem depending on what you expected from a bag of potato snacks. Nobody called them forgettable. Nobody put them down after one, somewhere in a test kitchen or a production meeting, before the first bag shipped to Boise, before the first grocery circular ran in Pennsylvania. Someone held one of those chips and bit down and heard that sound, that specific unrepeatable crack, and understood that they had something different. Not better than everything, not the last chip anyone would ever need, but genuinely, unmistakably different from what was already out there. That was enough. In 1988, in a snack aisle already crowded with options, different was everything. By 1989, O Boise's had earned their place on the shelf, not through novelty alone, but through repeat purchase. By 1989, O Boise's had earned their place on the shelf, not through novelty alone, but through repeat purchase. That is the only vote that matters in the grocery business. A shopper buys something once out of curiosity. They buy it a second time because it was worth it. They buy it automatically without reading the label, without comparing prices, because it has become part of the routine. O Boise's reached that third stage faster than almost any snack launch of the decade. The bag itself was part of it. Bright, bold packaging, the kind that caught your eye from 3 feet away in a crowded aisle. It sat on the shelf between the Doritos and the Pringles, and it looked like neither. It looked like something that had earned its spot through sheer confidence. At 89 cents for a 6.5-ounce bag in 1988, it was priced where a kid's allowance could reach it and where a parent grabbing snacks for the week didn't have to think twice. The bag was light in your hand. You could feel the chips shifting inside, hear them moving. You knew before you opened it that there was something different about the weight, the density, the way the content settled. Then you opened it. The smell came first. Potato, real potato, not the artificial dust that coated most fabricated chips. And then the sound. That crunch was the thing people remembered 30 years later with a specificity that no amount of time had softened. Not the papery snap of a thin chip, not the airy collapse of a cheese puff, a genuine, dense, structural crack. The sound of 2 layers of potato dough releasing their tension at once. You didn't eat O Boise's quietly. The person sitting next to you at the lunch table knew exactly what you were eating. That lunch table was where O Boise's built their deepest loyalty. Across the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the chip became a lunchbox staple for a generation of American kids whose mothers had discovered that a bag of O Boise's traveled well, survived being sat on, and would actually be eaten rather than traded away. The dual-sheeted construction that made them crunch so loudly also made them structurally resilient. They didn't crumble at the bottom of a bag, they arrived intact. For a working parent packing lunches at 7 in the morning, that was a practical virtue that no amount of advertising could have manufactured. After school was its own ritual. You dropped the backpack by the door, you went to the kitchen, and if there was a bag of O'Boise's in the cabinet, that was where the afternoon started. Fan communities that formed decades later consistently returned to this specific image. The after-school kitchen, the bag, the sound, the flavor. One person wrote that their best friend's mother always had O'Boise's waiting. Another remembered bringing 2 bags to every Girl Scout gathering because everybody liked them and nobody ever complained. A former Keebler sales representative, reflecting on the brand years after it was gone, put it simply, these were a big seller. The shelves moved. The reorders came in fast. O'Boise's were equally at home outdoors. Cookouts, block parties, summer picnics. The chip that didn't shatter when you tried to scoop dip was a genuinely useful thing to bring to a table full of people. Standard thin chips collapsed on contact with anything thicker than a light vinaigrette. O'Boise's held. You could press them into a dense French onion dip and pull them back out intact. That structural advantage was not a marketing claim. It was a physical fact, and it translated directly into social currency at every backyard gathering from 1988 through the early 1990s. The television commercial reinforced all of it. The Keebler elves, those small, enthusiastic, animated characters who had spent nearly 20 years selling cookies out of a hollow tree, took to O'Boise's with obvious conviction. The jingle was direct and self-aware. O'Boise's are boisterous. It played on Saturday mornings, wedged between cartoons, delivered into the living rooms of every American child who was old enough to nag a parent at the grocery store. A child who saw that commercial at 9 in the morning had a very specific destination in mind by the time the family made it to the supermarket that afternoon. The elves knew what they were selling. The kids knew what they were asking for. There was also a commercial that has stayed in the memory of people who saw it for reasons that are harder to explain. A man in a stairwell, acid-washed jeans, sport coat, dancing with a bag of O'Boise's. It was an odd piece of advertising by any measure. Slightly awkward, slightly too enthusiastic, not quite cool. But it was visible. It was specific. It lodged in the mind the way only genuinely strange advertising does. And 40 years later, people still describe it to each other when the subject of O'Boise's comes up, as though the weirdness of the commercial was itself part of the product's personality. O'Boise's were loud. O'Boise's were a little boisterous. Even the advertising knew it. By the early 1990s, Keebler's total salty snack sales, O'Boise's, Tato Skins, Ripplins, and Sunchurros together, had reached approximately $200 million annually, according to figures reported in Crane's Chicago Business. O'Boise's was the flagship of that portfolio. A May 1989 column in the Chicago Tribune noted that the brand's performance with grocery chains had made retailers unusually receptive to whatever Keebler brought to them next. That was a significant statement in a business where shelf space is contested every single week and no brand is ever guaranteed its position. The workers at the Bluffton, Indiana plant understood what they were part of. The dual-sheeted line was unlike anything else running in American snack manufacturing. The machinery was specialized, the process required skill, and the people who ran it knew that what came off that line was not interchangeable with what any other facility in the country was producing. There was a particular pride that attaches to making something genuinely difficult, something that requires a specific place and a specific set of hands. The Bluffton plant had that. The people there knew it. What did it feel like to find O'Boise's in the grocery cart in 1990? It felt like nothing, in the best possible sense. It felt automatic, unremarkable, expected. The highest compliment a snack food can receive is not that people love it. It is that people stop noticing they're buying it, because not buying it would be the strange choice. O'Boise's had reached that place. They were just always there, which is exactly what made it so disorienting when one day they weren't. In the spring of 1988, Keebler did not ease O'Boise's into the market the way most new snack brands did. With a regional test, a careful rollout, a slow come. In the spring of 1988, Keebler did not ease Oboise's into the market the way most new snack brands did, with a regional test, a careful rollout, a slow accumulation of shelf space over months and years. They moved fast. The grand launch happened on March 3rd in Boise. 6 days later, Oboise's were already in a grocery circular in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Within a few months, they were national. That speed was not an accident. It was a calculated bet made by a company that understood exactly what it had and understood that the window to establish a new chip brand against Frito-Lay's dominance was not going to stay open indefinitely. The distribution infrastructure that made that speed possible was one of Keebler's genuine competitive advantages. The company had spent decades building relationships with grocery chains across the country. The same buyers, the same store managers, the same retail partners who had been receiving Chips Deluxe and EL Fudge and Club Crackers for years. When Keebler's sales representatives walked into those meetings with Oboise's, they were not strangers asking for a favor. They were proven partners asking for shelf space for something new from a name the buyer already trusted. That trust translated directly into placement. And placement in the grocery business is the difference between a product that gets tried and a product that gets ignored. The pitch was straightforward and it was honest. This is not another thin chip. This is not a Pringles knockoff. This is something built differently from Idaho potatoes using a process nobody else in the country can replicate. The dual-sheeted construction was not just a talking point. It was a verifiable physical difference that any buyer who opened a bag could confirm in 30 seconds. The chip looked different, it felt different, it sounded different. Keebler's sales team didn't have to oversell it. They handed over a bag and let the product do the work. By the end of 1988, Oboise's and Sinceros, Keebler's new tortilla chip, which launched alongside Oboise's in the spring, had generated roughly $100 million in combined sales, according to Keebler's own public relations statements cited in Prepared Foods in 1989. Oboise's was the larger performer of the two. By May of 1989, the Chicago Tribune's marketing column was reporting that Oboise's had done such strong business with grocery chains that retailers were unusually receptive to whatever Keebler brought them next. That is a specific kind of success. Not just the product moving off shelves, but the product changing the relationship between the manufacturer and the retail trade. Oboise's had given Keebler credibility in a category where it had none 18 months earlier. The vending machine presence told a parallel story. Supermarket success is one measure. Vending machine placement is a different one entirely. It means the chip has cleared a separate set of buyers, survived the logistical constraints of a machine that can only hold so many SKUs, and proven that it will sell in a context where the consumer has no other options and no shelf to browse. Oboise's earned that placement. They showed up in vending machines in office buildings, factory floors, military bases. A soldier stationed at a base who happened to be from Boise found Oboise's in the machine down the hall and felt something that went beyond snack preference. The name alone was a small piece of home. That is the kind of emotional resonance that no marketing budget can manufacture. It either exists in the product or it doesn't. Convenience stores added another layer. The gas station cooler, the corner store counter, the highway rest stop rack. Oboise's occupied those spaces alongside Doritos and Lay's, which in 1988 and 1989 was still a significant statement. Frito-Lay did not share that real estate generously with competitors. The fact that Oboise's were there at all meant that store owners had made an active decision to give up a facing that could have gone to an established brand. They made that decision because customers were asking for Oboise's by name. Demand was pulling the product into new channels rather than the company pushing it. Crane's Chicago Business reported that Keebler's total salty snack sales had reached approximately $200 million annually by late 1988, representing roughly 5% of the total American salty snack market. That market was worth approximately $4 billion a year. Frito-Lay held 42%. Borden held 9%. Keebler's 5% had been built from nothing in less than 3 years, and Oboise's was the clearest proof that the strategy was working. But inside those numbers was a tension that the success itself was creating. The Bluffton, Indiana plant was the only facility in the country capable of running the dual-sheeted line at commercial scale. As demand grew, that single point of production became an increasingly fragile foundation for a national brand. The dual-sheeted process was not something that could be replicated quickly at a second facility. The machinery was specialized, the process required trained operators, and the capital cost of building a parallel line was substantial. Frito-Lay, with its network of regional plants spread across the country, could absorb a production disruption at any single facility without a customer ever noticing. Keebler could not make that same claim about Oboise's. The cost structure told an equally uncomfortable story. A fabricated chip built through a proprietary, dual-sheeted process cost more to make than a standard chip cut from a whole potato and fried in a conventional line. That cost differential was manageable when Oboise's commanded their shelf price without resistance. It became a serious problem the moment Frito-Lay decided to respond, not by matching the product, which they couldn't, but by flooding the aisle with promotions, price cuts, and new SKUs designed to crowd out every inch of shelf space that Oboise's had earned. The competition that was coming was not going to be fought on taste. It was going to be fought on scale. And Keebler, for all the speed and confidence of the Oboise's launch, was bringing a single plant in Indiana to a fight against the largest snack food company in the world. There is a particular kind of cultural saturation that only a handful of products in any generation achieve. There is a particular kind of cultural saturation that only a handful of products in any generation achieve. It is the point at which the product stops being a choice and becomes a given. A permanent fixture of the American domestic landscape, as unremarkable and as essential as the paper towels under the sink or the ketchup in the refrigerator door. Oboise's reached that point somewhere between 1989 and 1991. They did not arrive there through a single moment or a single campaign. They arrived there the way all genuinely beloved things do, gradually, then completely. The numbers, stated once and then set aside, tell the opening of the story. By 1991, the Orlando Sentinel was listing Oboise's alongside Riplin's and Tato Skins as the main brands of a Keebler salty snack division that held 5% of the American market. Frito-Lay held 42%. The gap was enormous. But 5% of a $4 billion market meant that Oboise's were in enough American homes, enough lunch bags, enough vending machines and corner store racks to constitute a genuine national presence. They were not a regional favorite or a cult item. They were a mainstream American snack at the height of their reach. What the numbers cannot capture is what it felt like to live inside that reach. It felt like a summer afternoon in the Midwest in 1990, with a bowl of French onion dip on the picnic table and a bag of Oboise's open beside it, and nobody having to explain what they were or why they were there. It felt like a Tuesday night in a house in Indiana or Pennsylvania or Florida, with a bag on the coffee table and something on television, and the sound of that crunch filling the room at regular intervals. It felt like the particular satisfaction of a snack that delivered exactly what it promised every single time. No variation, no disappointment, no bag where the seasoning was off or the chips had gone soft. The dual-sheeted construction that made Oboise's expensive to produce also made them extraordinarily consistent. That consistency was the quiet engine of their loyalty. The television commercial had by this point done its work so thoroughly that the jingle had moved from advertising into something closer to cultural reflex. Oboise's are boisterous. Children who had heard it on Saturday morning in 1988 were still carrying it in 1991. Adults who had never paid particular attention to snack food advertising found themselves humming it in the grocery store. The Keebler elves, those reliable ambassadors of the Hollow Tree, had given Oboise's something that most snack brands spend decades trying to achieve and never quite manage: a sonic identity. You didn't have to see the bag to know the brand. You just had to hear someone say the name, and the jingle completed itself automatically in your head. Generational transmission was happening in real time. Parents who had discovered Oboise's in 1988 were now buying them as a matter of course for children who had grown up knowing nothing else. For those children, the ones born in the late 1970s and early 1980s who were coming of age exactly as Oboise's hit their peak, the chip was not a novelty. It was a fact. It was the chip that was always in the cabinet, always in the lunchbox, always on the table when company came. A child who grows up with something in the house does not experience it as a product. They experience it as part of the texture of their life. That is a form of loyalty that advertising cannot create and that competitors cannot simply purchase away. The sour cream and onion variety had by this point separated itself from the rest of the lineup in the way that certain flavors do when they stop being a variant and become the reason. People who bought Oboise's bought them for the original and stayed for the sour cream and onion. Women who were pregnant found themselves craving it specifically. Not chips in general, not sour cream and onion flavor in general, but Oboise's sour cream and onion in particular, which is the clearest possible evidence that the flavor had achieved something distinct from its category. A craving that specific is not about hunger. It is about memory and chemistry and the particular way that one product had encoded itself in the nervous system as the standard against which everything else was measured. The workers at the Bluffton plant were running at capacity. The dual-sheeted line that Miles Willard had designed was producing the only chip in America that could be made on it, and the demand for that chip was not showing any signs of softening. There was a pride in that facility that went beyond employment. The people who ran those machines understood that what they were producing was not interchangeable with anything else. The chip that came off their line was the chip, the one with the air pockets, the one with the real potato flavor, the one that sounded different from everything else on the shelf. That knowledge mattered to them. It gave the work a specificity that most manufacturing jobs do not carry. How long can something be everywhere before it starts to seem inevitable? How long before the people responsible for it begin to treat it as permanent rather than earned? By 1992, the answer to both questions was beginning to reveal itself. Not to the shoppers, who were still buying without thinking. Not to the children, who were still reaching into the cabinet without checking. But in the offices of United Biscuits Holdings in London, where the ledgers for the American salty snack division were being reviewed with increasing scrutiny, the first serious questions about Oboise's were not about flavor or loyalty or cultural reach. They were about margin. They were about scale. They were about whether a chip that cost more to make than any competitor could match was a sustainable business or a beautiful mistake. The shelf was still full, but the conversation that would empty it had already begun. The trouble did not announce itself. The trouble did not announce itself. It never does. In 1992 and 1993, the average American shopper pushing a cart through the snack aisle had no reason to suspect that anything had changed. The bag was still there. The price was still reasonable. The crunch was still the same. From the outside, Oboise's looked exactly like what they had always been. A permanent fixture, a reliable choice, a snack that had earned its place on the shelf and intended to keep it. Inside the numbers, the picture was different. Frito-Lay's response to Keebler's salty snack expansion had been slow to materialize, but devastating in its patience. The largest snack food company in the world did not need to match Oboise's chip for chip. It needed only to make the economics of competing with it increasingly painful. Price promotions on Lay's and Doritos compressed the margin that every competing brand needed to justify its shelf space. New SKUs from Frito-Lay crowded the aisle, forcing grocery buyers to make hard choices about which brands earned facings and which ones got pushed toward the back row or eliminated entirely. Frito-Lay did not need to beat Oboise's on taste. They needed only to make Oboise's too expensive to keep fighting for. Anheuser-Busch's Eagle Snacks had entered the market aggressively in the late 1980s, adding a third competitor with deep pockets and a national distribution network. Eagle was not a long-term threat. It would be abruptly shut down in February 1996, leaving a significant void. But during the years it was active, it added pressure to a market where margins were already being squeezed from multiple directions simultaneously. Every dollar that Eagle and Frito-Lay spent on promotions was a dollar that made Keebler's cost structure look worse by comparison. That cost structure was the core vulnerability, and it had been there from the beginning. The dual-sheeted process at the Bluffton, Indiana plant was the source of everything that made Oboise's worth buying. The texture, the crunch, the potato flavor, the structural integrity that let them survive a lunchbox and hold up against a bowl of dip. But that same process costs significantly more to run than a conventional chip line. Frito-Lay could manufacture a bag of Lays at a cost per unit that Keebler could not approach with Oboise's, and that gap did not narrow as volume increased. It was baked into the technology itself. In June of 1995, industry analysts, cited in trade reporting, attributed Keebler's retreat from the salty snack category directly to the difficulty of competing against Frito-Lay's scale. The word they used was scale, not quality, not consumer preference, not brand weakness. Scale. The implication was clear. Oboise's had not lost the argument about what the better chip was. They had lost the argument about what the better business was. Those are two entirely different arguments, and only one of them gets decided at the grocery store. The shoppers did not know this. A woman in Indiana who had been buying Oboise's every week since 1988 had no access to trade, reporting, or analyst commentary. What she had was a bag on the shelf and a habit. What she would eventually have was the beginning of a slow, disorienting experience that she would not be able to name for years. The sense that something she counted on was becoming harder to find, that the shelf space was shrinking, that certain stores had stopped carrying it while others still had it, that the distribution was becoming uneven in a way that felt random but was anything but. A former customer who had grown up eating Oboise's in Indiana and then moved to North Carolina captured this experience precisely when she wrote, years later, that she had spent years assuming Oboise's were a regional chip sold only near Indiana. She had moved away and simply stopped finding them. The idea that they had once been national, that the problem was not geography but discontinuation, took years to reach her. That gap between the corporate reality and the consumer experience is where the loss of Oboise's actually lived. Not in a boardroom decision, but in the quiet, accumulating confusion of a loyal customer who could no longer find what she was looking for and did not know why. United Biscuits Holdings, Keebler's British parent company, had been evaluating its American portfolio through the mid-1990s, with the particular cold eye of a multinational looking for places to reduce complexity. The salty snacks division, Oboise's, Riplin's, the plants in Bluffton and Haltom City, Texas and Oxford, Pennsylvania, was a division that required specialized manufacturing, faced an unwinnable scale competition with Frito-Lay, and was generating losses in a period when the entire Keebler enterprise was under pressure. By 1995, Keebler's total operations were producing negative $93 million in EBITDA on $1.6 billion in sales. The salty snack division was not solely responsible for that figure, but it was not helping. How many things that people love disappear not because they failed, but because they were never quite large enough to be worth protecting? The decision to sell the salty snacks division was made at a level so far removed from the Bluffton plant, from the Saturday morning commercials, from the lunch boxes and the picnic tables and the vending machines in the hallways of American office buildings, that the people who made it almost certainly never thought about any of those things at all. They thought about margin, they thought about scale, they thought about the difficulty of competing with Frito-Lay using a manufacturing process that existed in exactly one building in the state of Indiana. They were not wrong about any of it. That is the part that is hardest to sit with. The decision to walk away from Oboise's was, by the logic of the spreadsheet, entirely defensible. The chip that millions of Americans were still buying without thinking, still reaching for automatically, still feeding to their children as a fact of domestic life. That chip was, by the cold measure of corporate arithmetic, a problem waiting to be solved. The solution was coming, and the people eating Oboise's in 1994 and 1995 had no idea. In mid-1995, United Biscuits Holdings put the Keebler Salty Snacks division up for sale. In mid-1995, United Biscuits Holdings put the Keebler Salty Snacks division up for sale. The assets on offer included the Oboise's and Riplin's brand names, manufacturing facilities in Haltom City, Texas and Oxford, Pennsylvania, and the distribution infrastructure that had spent 7 years building Oboise's into a national brand. What was not included in the sale And this is the detail that explains almost everything that happened afterward, was the Bluffton, Indiana plant, the facility that housed the only dual-sheeted production line in the United States, the machinery that Miles Willard had designed and that no other manufacturer in the country could replicate, was separated from the brand it had created. Someone bought the name. Someone else kept the machine. The brand went to Wabash Foods, LLC. Wabash Foods was not Keebler. They did not have Keebler's history with the product, Keebler's institutional memory of what made O'Boisie's work, or Keebler's relationship with the retail partners who had given O'Boisie's its national shelf presence. What they had was a license to use the name and whatever manufacturing capacity they could assemble. A 1998 article in Capital Press noted that Wabash Foods in Bluffton, Indiana, was attempting to restart production at a former Keebler plant, which suggests that some version of the dual-sheeted capability may have been available to them, at least in the short term. But attempting to restart a specialized production line is not the same as running one that has never stopped. The institutional knowledge required to operate that machinery, the trained operators, the quality control protocols, the accumulated understanding of how the process behaved under different conditions, does not transfer automatically with a lease or a purchase agreement. It lives in the people who have been running the line for years, and those people had scattered. What reached store shelves under the O'Boisie's name in the mid to late 1990s, if anything consistently did, was a chip carrying a brand identity that had been built entirely on a specific manufacturing process that may or may not have been fully intact. The loyal customers who had spent 7 years calibrating their expectations to a very particular crunch, a very particular texture, a very particular flavor, those customers had no way of knowing whether what they were buying was the same chip or a reasonable approximation or something else entirely. The bag said O'Boisie's. The chip inside may have been doing its best. Whether its best was good enough is a question that the fan communities formed years later still argue about without resolution. Poor Brothers Inc. acquired the brand in 1999. Poor Brothers was an Arizona-based snack company with a portfolio of regional and specialty products. They were not a bad company. They were simply a company with no particular reason to treat O'Boisie's as anything other than one asset among many, a brand with name recognition and a loyal, if aging, consumer base, sitting in a portfolio alongside other products that required attention, investment, and management. The specific gravity that O'Boisie's had once possessed, the institutional commitment that came from being a flagship product of a major manufacturer, was gone. The chip had become a line item. Meanwhile, Kellogg's acquired the remainder of the Keebler Company in March of 2001. The cookie and cracker business, the Elves, the Hollow Tree, all of it moved to Battle Creek, Michigan. The salty snack division had already been gone for 6 years by that point, sold off and passed along before Kellogg's ever entered the picture. The company that had created O'Boisie's, that had licensed Miles Willard's technology and built the Bluffton plant and run the Saturday morning commercials and trained the sales force that had walked O'Boisie's into every major grocery chain in the country. That company no longer had any connection to the chip that bore the name. Keebler and O'Boisie's had been legally separated for half a decade before Kellogg's bought what remained. Poor Brothers eventually merged into the Inventure Group, a Phoenix-based snack company that traded on the NASDAQ under the ticker SNAC. By early 2009, Inventure was preparing a relaunch of the O'Boisie's brand. CEO Terry McDaniel mentioned O'Boisie's on an earnings call that year, describing it as having been, at its peak, a $300 million brand. He was careful to flag that figure as secondhand, information he had been given rather than confirmed from records. The documented figure is smaller. Keebler's entire salty snack division reported approximately $192 million in total sales in 1995, the year it went up for sale, with O'Boisie's as the flagship. Whatever the precise peak revenue was, McDaniel's point was clear. This was not a forgotten regional snack. This was a brand with real history and real consumer demand, and Inventure intended to bring it back. The relaunch emphasized two things: the Bluffton facility and the dual-sheeted process. Both were presented as still operational, still unique, still the foundation of what made Oboise's different from everything else on the market. Whether the line running in 2009 was producing a chip identical to the one that had come off that same line in 1989 is impossible to verify with certainty. What is verifiable is that on December 3rd, 2009, an advertisement in the La Follette Press offered Terry's classic Oboises in 8-ounce bags as part of a buy one get one free promotion. The chips were back on store shelves. The name was real. The bag existed. The flavors were not the same. The 2009 relaunch offered original, sour cream and cheddar, and jalapeno cheddar. The sour cream and onion, the flavor that decades of loyal customers cited first, and most specifically when they described what they had lost, was not among them. That substitution, whether it was a cost decision or a reformulation, or simply a judgment call about what the market wanted in 2009, was not a small thing to the people who had been waiting. The sour cream and cheddar was close in structure. It was not the same in memory. Fan accounts from the period are consistent on this point. The texture was recognizable. The crunch was there, or something like it. The flavor was different enough to notice. One person who found Oboises at a Dollar Tree in Connecticut brought them home and ate them immediately and reported that they tasted just like she remembered. Another was less certain. The disagreement between those two accounts is not surprising. Memory is not a neutral instrument, and a chip you have been imagining for 15 years is always going to be more perfect than the chip that actually arrives. But the disagreement itself is significant. A product that had once been so consistent that a former sales representative described it simply as a big seller, no qualifications, no hedging, had become a product about which reasonable people could not agree on whether it was the same thing. By 2010, documented references to Oboises in retail advertising had effectively ceased. The Inventure relaunch had produced a real product that reached real shelves in some markets for some period of time. It had not produced a sustained national return. The brand that had once been automatic, the chip you reached for without thinking, the snack that was just always there, had become something you might find at a dollar store if you were lucky, something you might read about online if you knew where to look, something that existed in the space between discontinued and available, which is one of the lonelier places a beloved product can occupy. A question had formed by this point that nobody with authority over the brand had answered publicly, or perhaps even privately. If the dual-sheeted process was still running in Bluffton, if the machinery was still operational, if the brand name still carried enough consumer recognition that a CEO mentioned it on an earnings call as a $300 million property. Then what exactly was standing between Oboises and the shelf? The answer, as best as it can be reconstructed from the available record, was nothing dramatic. No single catastrophic decision, no scandal, no safety recall. No moment where someone in a boardroom said the words that ended it. Just the accumulated weight of 4 ownership changes in 15 years, each one introducing new management with new priorities and new portfolios and new calculations about where to direct limited capital and attention. Just the slow erosion of institutional commitment to a product that required a specific, expensive, irreplaceable manufacturing process and return margins that could not compete with the economics of a conventional chip line. Just a brand that had been passed from hand to hand until the hands that held it no longer knew what they were holding. A store manager in a supermarket somewhere in the Midwest received a notice sometime in the mid-1990s informing her that Oboises would no longer be available. A store manager in a supermarket somewhere in the Midwest received a notice sometime in the mid-1990s informing her that Oboises would no longer be available for reorder. There was no ceremony attached to it. It came the way all discontinuation notices came. Through the standard ordering system, a flag on a SKU, a line item removed from a catalog. She would have noted it, pulled the remaining stock from the shelf when it sold through, and filled the space with something else. The space was always filled with something else. That is the first law of the grocery aisle. Nothing stays empty for long. What she could not have known, and what the notice did not mention, was that the customers who had been buying Oboises from that shelf for 7 years were about to experience something they would not have a word for until the internet gave them a place to describe it. Not grief exactly. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more persistent than either. The low-grade disorientation of reaching for something that has always been there and finding nothing, and then reaching again the following week with the irrational conviction that the first time must have been a mistake. It was not a mistake. The disappearance of Oboises did not happen on a single day in a single place. That is one of the things that made it so difficult to process, both at the time and in the years that followed. There was no national announcement, no press release, no farewell campaign with a final bag signed by the Keebler elves. The chip left the way it had arrived in some markets, gradually, then all at once, then differently depending on where you lived. In Indiana and the Midwest, where the Bluffton plant had given Oboises a kind of geographic intimacy, the shelves went quiet earlier. Along the East Coast and in parts of the South, certain stores continued to receive stock into the mid-1990s. In Florida, there were reports of Oboises still appearing in vending machines well after they had vanished from supermarket shelves in other regions. This unevenness created a particular kind of confusion that the absence of any official communication made worse. A customer in Indiana stopped finding Oboises in early 1993 and concluded reasonably that production had ended. A customer in Florida bought them from a vending machine in 1995 and had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. A woman who had grown up eating them in Indiana and then moved to North Carolina assumed for years that they were a regional product sold only near the Bluffton plant, that she had simply moved away from the distribution area. The truth, that the brand had been sold, that the manufacturing was in a state of uncertain transition, that what was happening was not a geographic limitation, but a corporate dissolution, was not available to her. She had no way to access it. She just knew she couldn't find the chip anymore, and she filed it under the category of things that were true about her old home, that were not true about her new one. The children who had grown up eating Oboises were, by the mid-1990s, old enough to do their own grocery shopping. Some of them went looking. They checked the snack aisle in the store where they had always found Oboises and didn't find them. They asked a store employee who checked the system and said the item was no longer carried. They drove to another store. They checked there. They asked again. This is not a hypothetical. Fan accounts collected across multiple online communities in the 2000s and 2010s describe exactly this experience in exactly these terms, with a consistency that suggests it was common enough to constitute a shared cultural moment. People went looking for Oboises the way you go looking for something you have lost in a familiar place, expecting to find it where it has always been, and encountering instead the simple, final fact of its absence. The internet arrived, and with it a place for that absence to speak. The early online communities that formed around discontinued foods in the late 1990s and early 2000s were not sophisticated operations. They were message boards and comment sections and rudimentary fan sites where people typed what they remembered and hoped that someone else remembered the same thing. Oboises appeared on those platforms early and often. The site intheeighties.com accumulated a comment thread that ran for years, filling steadily with the specific, unhesitating testimony of people who knew exactly what they had lost and wanted someone to confirm that they hadn't imagined it. The comments were not nostalgic in the soft, decorative sense of the word. They were urgent. Best chip ever, that's all. I used to cry when I couldn't get a bag. I was a salesman for Keebler in the early 90s. These were a big seller. Why did they go away? Were they cost prohibitive to make? I just haven't had anything quite as good since. I've always wondered what happened to them. I want a bag so bad right now. The language was present tense, not past tense. These were not people mourning something they had made peace with. These were people who had been waiting, without much hope, for someone to tell them the chip was coming back. Nobody told them that. In 2017, Keebler, by then a brand within the Kellogg's portfolio, its connection to the original salty snacks division, long since severed, responded to a fan request on Twitter with the following: "Thanks for your request to see Oboises back on store shelves in the future. We love hearing from our fans." It was the corporate equivalent of a form letter. It acknowledged the request without engaging with it. It offered warmth without substance. It was, for the people who received it, Precisely the kind of response that demonstrates how completely a company can lose the thread of what made a product matter, not through malice, but through the accumulated distance of too many years and too many ownership changes in too many portfolios in which Oboise's was one line item among hundreds. The 2009 revival under the Terry's Classic banner had offered a brief, genuine moment of possibility. The December advertisement in the La Follette Press, the bags at Dollar Tree locations in Connecticut and Minnesota, the Amazon listing for sour cream and cheddar that one commenter reported finding and ordering immediately. People brought the bags home, they opened them, they bit down, and then they did something that speaks to the depth of the original product's hold on them. They wrote about it. They compared it to what they remembered. They debated whether it was the same. The very act of doing that, of subjecting a snack chip to the kind of careful, specific, memory-tested evaluation normally reserved for things of much greater consequence, was itself a form of tribute. By 2011, the revival had faded without announcement, the same way the original had faded without announcement. The Dollar Tree shelves returned to their usual inventory. The Amazon listing disappeared. The La Follette press advertisement was a historical record rather than a current offer. Oboise's existed again as a memory, this time with the additional weight of a failed return, which is a particular kind of loss because it means the hope that had sustained people for 15 years had been tested and found insufficient. Pop culture writer Dinosaur Dracula, cataloging the archaeology of American snack history, purchased 3 vintage bags of Oboise's that were decades old and documented the experience of opening them. The bags themselves had become artifacts, objects that people would pay money to possess, not because they expected to enjoy them, but because they needed to hold something real from a time that felt increasingly distant. That is not how snack foods are supposed to work. Snack foods are supposed to be eaten and forgotten. The ones that become artifacts are the ones that were never just snack foods to begin with. What filled the shelf space that Oboise's left behind? The honest answer is that nothing filled it, not in the way that matters. Baked Lays arrived in the 1990s with a promise of lighter texture. Pop chips came in the 2000s with a marketing language borrowed directly from the experience Oboise's had pioneered. Airy, popped, not fried. Skinny Pop offered a variation on the same theme. Each of these products found its audience. None of them were Oboise's. None of them had the dual-sheeted construction, the specific density of the crunch, the real potato flavor that Miles Willard had spent years engineering into a form that could survive a bag and a shelf and a cross-country distribution run and still taste like something that came from the ground. The shelf was full again. It had been full again for 30 years, and somewhere in every one of those full shelves was the ghost of a space that used to hold something specific and irreplaceable. Something that a store manager in the Midwest had quietly removed one unremarkable afternoon and replaced with the next thing in line, never knowing and never being told what she was taking down. The shelf space that Oboise's had occupied did not stay contested for long. The shelf space that Oboise's had occupied did not stay contested for long. That is the nature of the grocery aisle. It has no memory, no loyalty, no capacity for mourning. A product disappears and the space closes behind it, like water closing over a stone. And within a week, something else is there, facing outward, waiting to be chosen by someone who may never have known what stood there before. What moved into those facings in the mid-1990s was not a single product, but a category shift. The snack industry was reading the same consumer research that had helped accelerate Oboise's decline. And what that research was saying was that American shoppers, particularly the parents who had been the core Oboise's buyer, were beginning to want something they could feel slightly better about eating. Not health food, not diet food, something positioned at a slight angle to guilt, carrying language about baking rather than frying, about lightness rather than indulgence. Baked Lays launched in 1994 and became one of the most successful snack introductions of the decade. The timing was not a coincidence. The space that Oboise's and chips like them had occupied was being redefined by the companies with the scale to redefine it. And Frito-Lay had that scale in a way that no successor to the Keebler salty snack division ever would. The specific customers that Oboise's had lost, the ones who had been buying them since 1988, who had fed them to children now old enough to have children of their own, went looking for a replacement and largely failed to find one. The fan communities that formed online in the 2000s are full of this particular testimony. People describing every chip they had tried in the intervening years, naming the ones that came closest, explaining precisely why each one fell short. The crunch was almost right, but not quite. The flavor was similar but thinner. The texture collapsed where Oboise's had held. Pop chips, which arrived in 2007 with a popped rather than fried construction and an airy interior that genuinely echoed what Miles Willard's dual-sheeted process had achieved, came closer than most. Several former Oboise's loyalists adopted them. Several others tried them, appreciated them, and then went back online to explain why appreciation was not the same as satisfaction. TGI Fridays potato skins chips, distributed through various channels including Dollar Tree locations, were cited repeatedly in fan discussions as carrying a texture identical to the Oboise's construction. An observation that one commenter attributed to the possibility that a version of the original recipe had found its way into that product's development. The claim was never verified, but the fact that people were making it, that they were examining the chip geometry of a TGI Friday snack with the focused attention of someone trying to identify a lost relative, says something about the depth of the original attachment and the inadequacy of every substitute that followed. The Bluffton, Indiana plant continued to change hands with the brand. Wabash Foods had attempted to restart the dual-sheeted line there in the late 1990s. Poor Brothers had taken it over in 1999. Inventure had inherited it after that. Each transition represented not just a change in corporate ownership, but a potential interruption in the accumulated operational knowledge required to run a manufacturing process that existed nowhere else in the country. A conventional chip plant can be sold and restarted with a new workforce relatively quickly. The dual-sheeted line at Bluffton was not a conventional chip plant. It was a specific piece of machinery that required specific expertise, and every year that passed without continuous production was a year in which that expertise became harder to reconstitute. Miles Willard himself continued to work. His Idaho Falls firm, Miles Willard Technologies, remained active in the fabricated snack industry long after Oboise's had left the national market. The technology he had developed was not lost. It existed in patents, in documentation, in the institutional memory of the people who had worked with him. But technology without the organizational commitment to deploy it at scale is potential rather than product. And the organizational commitment that Oboise's required, a manufacturer willing to operate a single-purpose facility, absorb the higher cost structure, compete for shelf space against Frito-Lay's promotional budgets, had not materialized in any sustained way since Keebler had walked away from the category in 1995. The broader lesson that the food industry drew from Keebler's salty snack experience was not primarily a lesson about Oboise's. It was a lesson about the limits of competing against scale with specificity. Keebler had built genuinely innovative products, Oboise's, Tato Skins, Pizzerias, Sinceros, and had taken 5% of a $4 billion market in less than a decade. That was a remarkable achievement. It was also, in the end, insufficient. Frito-Lay's 42% was not just a larger number. It was a different kind of operation, a scale of manufacturing, distribution, and retail leverage that made the economics of competition increasingly untenable for any challenger that could not match it facility for facility, market by market, promotion by promotion. What Oboise's demonstrated in its rise and its disappearance was that American consumers were entirely capable of supporting a snack that was genuinely different, genuinely better in specific ways, genuinely worth seeking out. The loyalty was real. The repeat purchase was real. The emotional attachment, which showed no signs of diminishing 30 years after the chip had left the market, was real. What the market could not protect was the business behind the chip. The single plant, the proprietary process, the cost structure that made Oboise's possible and made Oboise's vulnerable in exactly the same measure. The communities of people who still talked about Oboise's online were not naive about this. The former Keebler sales representative who had described the chip as a big seller had also asked in the same breath, whether it had been cost prohibitive to make. The question answered itself. The fan who had driven to multiple stores looking for Oboise's after they disappeared understood, on some level, that the absence was not an error that would be corrected. The people who had loved Oboise's were not waiting for a corporation to rescue them from their loss. They were doing what people do with irreplaceable things. They were keeping the memory precise, comparing notes, making sure that what they remembered was confirmed by someone else who remembered the same thing. What do we lose when a specific flavor disappears and nothing takes its place? Not the shelf space, which fills immediately, but the thing itself, the particular combination of process and ingredient in timing that made it what it was and that cannot be reconstructed by anyone who was not there when it was made? That question does not have a comfortable answer. The shelf is full, the market is efficient, new products arrive every year with new claims about texture and flavor, and the particular kind of crunch that everybody has apparently been waiting for. Some of them are good. Some of them find their loyal customers and hold them for years. None of them are Oboise's, and none of them will be, because Oboise's was not a flavor profile or a marketing position that can be replicated by a company willing to invest in the right equipment. It was a specific convergence of a specific inventor, a specific plant, a specific moment in American snack culture, and a specific group of people who happened to be the right age at the right time to receive it as a fact of their daily lives rather than a novelty or a nostalgia item. That convergence happened once. It produced something real. And when the corporate structures that sustained it collapsed under the weight of competitive economics and ownership transitions, what was lost was not just a product, but the unrepeatable conditions that had made the product possible. The shelf closed. The water closed over the stone. And what remained was the memory, held with a specificity that 30 years had not softened, by the people who had been there when the bag was always on the shelf and the crunch was always the same, and nobody had any reason to think that either of those things would ever change. There is a kitchen somewhere in America, Indiana maybe, or Pennsylvania, or Florida, it doesn't matter, where a Tuesday afternoon in 1990 is still perfectly. There is a kitchen somewhere in America, Indiana maybe, or Pennsylvania, or Florida, it doesn't matter, where a Tuesday afternoon in 1990 is still perfectly preserved in the memory of someone who is now in their 50s. The after-school light coming through the window, the sound of a backpack hitting the floor, the cabinet door opening, the bag in hand, bright, light, slightly puffed with the air pressure of a sealed product that had traveled well and arrived intact. The small resistance of the seal giving way. And then the smell, which was the smell of real potato. Not the simulated version, not the dust and powder approximation that coated most chips in that aisle, but something that registered in the nose as honest, as the thing itself. And then the sound. That crunch was not subtle. It was not the polite snap of a thin chip or the airy collapse of something fried in too much oil. It was structural. It was the sound of two layers of potato dough releasing their tension simultaneously, a crack that filled the kitchen and confirmed every single time that what you were eating was exactly what you expected it to be. The sour cream and onion hit the tongue a half-second later. Cool, specific, neither too sharp nor too mild. A flavor that had been calibrated by someone who understood that the point of a seasoned chip was not to overwhelm the potato, but to complete it. You ate one, you ate another. The bag was lighter than it looked and heavier than it felt, and somehow always gone before you had decided to finish it. That was Oboise's. Not the revenue figures, not the market share, not the 4 corporate owners or the single Indiana plant or the dual-sheeted process that made it all possible. That kitchen, that Tuesday, that sound. What made Oboise's matter beyond its ingredients was not complicated, though the food industry spent years failing to replicate it. It mattered because it was made by someone who was trying to solve a real problem. How to put the actual taste of an Idaho potato into a chip that could survive a supply chain and still taste like something true, and who succeeded in a way that the people eating the result could feel without being able to articulate. Miles Willard was not a marketer, he was an engineer, And the chip he engineered had the particular integrity of things made by people who care about the problem more than the product. You could taste the caring. That is not a romantic notion. It is a practical one. When the process is right and the ingredient is right and the intention is right, the result carries all three of those things into the mouth of the person eating it, and they know it, even if they never say so in those words. O'Boise's were also a product of a specific American moment, the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the supermarket was still the center of the American food universe, when the snack aisle was a genuine landscape of competition and innovation, rather than a managed portfolio of consolidated brands, when a company in Elmhurst, Illinois could license a technology from a man in Idaho Falls and put a chip on a shelf in Allentown, Pennsylvania within 6 days of the grand launch and have it become a fixture of American domestic life within a year. That moment is gone. The consolidation that ended O'Boise's was not an anomaly. It was the direction of an entire industry, and it has continued in the decades since, with a thoroughness that has made the snack aisle simultaneously larger and less various than it was in 1988. There are more products on those shelves now. There are fewer companies behind them. The people who made O'Boise's possible deserve to be named in the same breath as the product itself. The food scientists and production workers at the Bluffton plant who ran a specialized line that nobody else in the country could run, and who ran it with the pride that attaches to genuinely difficult work. The Keebler sales representatives who walked into grocery buyers' offices and handed over a bag and let the chip speak for itself. The parents who found it on the shelf and put it in the cart without overthinking it, and then put it in the lunchbox, and then bought it again the following week and again the week after that, until the repetition became a habit and the habit became a fact of the household. The children who ate it and grew up and are now in their 50s and still remember the sound. They are not wrong to remember it. That is the thing that matters most to say at the end of the story. The memory is not nostalgia in the dismissive sense, not a softened, inaccurate reconstruction of something that was never as good as it seems in retrospect. The memory is accurate. The chip was good. The crunch was real. The flavor was specific and honest and unrepeatable. And the people who remember it are remembering something that actually existed, something that was made with skill and intention in a specific place by specific people and delivered into their lives at a moment when they were young enough to receive it without qualification. That it is gone is a loss, not a tragedy, not a catastrophe, but a genuine loss, the kind that accrues quietly over the years, adding itself to the long list of things that were true about the world once and are not true about it anymore. The shelf is full of other things. Some of them are good. None of them are this. Somewhere tonight, someone is trying to describe that crunch to a person who has never heard it. The person listening has never tasted it, never held the bag, never stood in that kitchen on that Tuesday afternoon. But they understand, from the way it is being described, the specificity, the certainty, the slight catch in the voice of someone recounting something they did not know they would miss until it was already gone. That something real and particular and unrepeatable was here, and is not here anymore, and was worth every word it takes to remember it.